Hey guys, so today we're going to be making a tiling texture using a workflow I like to do starting out here in ZBrush, and you just want to make sure you have wrap mode on, and what that does is make it tile, so anything you put in the top fourth will get put in the other three corners. And for this tiling texture that I decided to make, it's literally a tile for tile floor type texture. And we're just making it from scratch and starting out and sculpting. I'm sculpting on a buck, a texture buck is what I call it. I model a 4x4 cube, and then a plane, and then we add a little bit of thickness to it, just so we're not sculpting through the back face. When we bring it into ZBrush to sculpt on, we need a little more there to subdivide to, but we'll keep a plain version that we can bake down to, because the only thing we're worried about is the image of that front face. Or in this case, it's the top view, so it'd be the top face of the sculpt here. There's two things I like to turn on regardless. You always want to be using wrap mode to create a tiling texture, but also turn on back face culling, and it helps out like if you're sculpting closer to the edge of your texture bug, we won't mess it up as bad. Like it won't indent, or we won't lose our framework on the geometry. So we're just adding granule detail and, where we see fit. You got to be careful not to make things too repetitive. In this case, I feel like I probably did with the little broken tile bits. Repeats too much. Then we're just adding some surface noise on top of our tiles. I don't think the surface noise actually tiles, but if you use it like completely zoomed in versus big chunks, then it's not that noticeable. If the texture is very grainy, then it won't be that big of a deal. One thing that I do before I export it out of ZBrush and bring it back into Blender is I make sure that I decimate it, because I'll be working on like a 2 million polygon buck, and then whenever I bring it into Blender, it's harder to bake because we're having to load all that extra information that's not necessary. And decimating, keeps the vital vertices to hold your sculpt together, while removing, most of the other polygons. You can pretty much cut it in half and still have the same amount of detail. One thing that I do in Blender whenever I import it is I make sure I shade smooth on the texture bug before I do any type of baking, so I don't get any like pixel artifacts. We create a texture image in Blender, and it's just a 2K, and make sure you turn non-color on versus the RGB. And then we'll be baking in Cycles Renderer, and if you just scroll down, there's a tab called Bake, and you want to make sure you have selected to active, and you want to do high poly to low poly. Just hold shift and high poly, and then select your low poly, and make sure your texture image is on your low poly. And I'll do parameters of like 0.4 projection, and that usually gives me a good bake. So we'll hook up the normal, we'll see how we're looking. I saw a little bit of a seam. I mean, this method isn't perfect. I don't think any method is perfect, and there's a ton of ways to do anything in 3D, but this is just one of my favorite ways to make tiling textures. But I'll export the image and I'll use it in my photo editor. I use Affinity Photo, and basically I'm just affining the texture, which means turning it inside out, similarly to the way we did things in ZBrush with the wrap mode. It cuts it into 4 and it takes the outside corners and points them inside. And we're just using the clone stamp tool on top of our normal map and just getting rid of that noticeable seam. And like I said, it's not that bad, but you know, if I notice it, then I'm gonna want to get rid of it. And this workflow is, you know, rather a back and forth workflow. So I'll export it after I affine the texture, and we'll get the seams removed if there is any. Sometimes it comes out perfect, but most of the time there's a little artifact or 1 or 2 artifacts that, you know, that's easy to remove just by clone stamping. So after we export it, we'll bring it back into Blender and test our texture, look at it in different lighting, and scale it in the UV map editor and make sure we're looking good. And then I'll export the normal map to 3D coat, which is where I'll finish the texture by painting it and adding a roughness map just using PBR materials. This material specifically I made from scratch using Affinity Photo. So the color map, the roughness, and the normal map for this texture, I did all of that in Affinity Photo. In 3D Coat, what I like to do once I get a normal map in here is I'll bake an ambient occlusion and a cavity map. And so it just reinforces our normal map. And then we'll just start adding layers for different materials. I use this main tile material that I made, and then I'll go back with mainly just using color on top of the tile material PBR, and just disabling roughness and the normal map, and then painting in the dark crevices and adding detail to it. And then we can export all our textures. In this case, I'm just using the diffuse roughness and the normal map. Make sure you save your normal map as a separate one, because you don't want to mess up your other one if you decide to change it later. And it's reusable, so it's a tileable texture. So I'll export these textures, and then we'll bring them back into Blender and just plug them into our material. We got our new normal plugged in, and that's what it's looking like. That's pretty much it. Yeah, I love doing this type of workflow for, you know, a variety of things, materials. I do the same workflow for trim sheets, but yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the video and like the results and can use this in your own projects. Thanks for watching, and we'll see y'all next time. Peace!